One of the greatest ironies about African heritage is that despite it being priceless, it often ranks very lowly in terms of government priority scales. And to talk more on this, we're now joined by Nicholas Wolpe from the Liliesleaf farm and also Christopher Till, who's the director of the Apartheid Museum. Good evening to you both, and thank you so much for your time. Quite a number of industries, Nicholas, if I can start with you here in studio, a number of industries have taken a knock during this pandemic, and certainly the Liliesleaf farm has not been exempted from this, and we saw a temporary closure of that particular farm. What impact have you had, when it comes to COVID-19, and how bad was it in terms of, economically? Were you able to keep the workers that are working there?
Well, I think firstly one should put the impact of COVID-19 into perspective. As I've been saying regularly, what COVID-19 has done is shone the spotlight very clearly on a sector that has for many years struggled in terms of acquiring the necessary funding in order to survive. So what COVID has done, it said, we've been impacted on the basis now that we've had to close. But closure is always, even pre-COVID, was always a threat. But it has been more devastating now, given the consequences of what COVID has done, as you've mentioned, across all sectors. We have managed up until December, I should say, last year to pay staff, and then we were not able to pay staff in December, January, February, March, and then a corporate came on board and provided us with funding to be able to pay March and April salary. But we are still not out of the woods. I mean, as we sit here now, we have no salaries to pay them in May. And we will then go back to where we were, where they were not able to come to work, we're not able to pay them, and we're not able to maintain and look after the site, which had become neglected because of the fact that they hadn't been into work for quite a long time. And that was a very sad experience, because even now, even though we've manicured the grounds, 80% of our exhibits at the moment are not working, either because they haven't been used for quite a while, or they have been damaged because of load shedding and power surges. So we sit with a problem which we need to address when we reopen, and that is, how do we repair these exhibits, which are extremely costly because of the level of technology. Just to give you an example, we have a strip around our interactive table, and it comes from China because it's not available in South Africa. That cost 100,000. So that gives you a kind of inkling in terms of the costs that we need to fork out when it comes to replacing, repairing, and maintaining the exhibits.
And Christopher, do you agree then with Nicholas's sentiments here to say that COVID-19 fast-tracked something that you were fearing that could actually happen anytime soon? Because from what Nicholas is saying, there hasn't really been much support that has been forthcoming.
Yes, there's no question about it that COVID-19 has been devastating. I mean, from the Apartheid Museum's perspective, we've essentially been self-sufficient, even though we do get some support from a corporate. And in February, March in 2020, we had to close. Now, from a position of where we managed to sustain ourselves and make a surplus, we've had no money coming in since that period. So whatever surplus we had has been eaten up to the point where we reached where we've had to retrench all staff. Now, for an institution such as the Apartheid Museum, or certainly the Liliesleaf and many other institutions which are critical to the understanding of the tragedy of apartheid, which really is not only within a South African context, but it's an international problem. It's an international issue. Racism is alive and well. It's out there. And we are here as an institution which should be being able to invite school children, visitors to our institutions, where we can inform them and hold the mirror to ourselves and say, we can never go there again. We're closed. And when it comes to support from government, we don't receive any support from government. And it seems a tragedy that we've reached this moment where our endeavors over 20-odd years have suddenly come to a point where we've had to mothball these institutions. So there has to be an extraordinarily innovative and focused attempt at engaging with an international and local community to support such important institutions.
And Christopher, if I can then just ask you, especially because you're saying that you've had to retrench the workers at the Apartheid Museum, were you then able to give them severance packages?
Yes, we were. But, you know, after having worked for an institution between 18 and 20 years, it's a tragedy to wave your eye. Yes, there were paid, but, you know, that is only for a period of time. And thereafter, you have to engage with your life in another way. But we're looking forward to try and reopen our institutions and plan for that and begin to re-energize and re-employ staff if we possibly can. We're fortunate in the sense that the Nelson site, which is a site which we created and which is still open and still running, we are managing to keep our head above water just by virtue of the fact that we have a large number of local visitors which pay the bills. But, you know, there is a sentiment where people say, well, why do we need to pay to see these things? We're saying, well, you know, somebody has to pay to be able to make sure that our heritage is out there, is available, and is part of the entire education process, which is not only a South African element which I've described, but which is an international factor. And that's where, if we're going forward and we have to win, my view is that we have to make partnerships with international agencies to assist us in this critical time.
Now, Nick, when one then looks at heritage, it's priceless. It's information, it's history, it's something that really shapes our thinking when it comes to the future and also knowing where we come from. Why then do you think it appears to rank so lowly when it comes to, you know, projects that are then put in place when it comes to preservation?
I mean, that's a very interesting question because, I mean, if you think about it, when you go to a doctor, the first thing they ask you about is history. Corporates make a big song and dance about the fact that they're 125 years old, 150 or 175. And when you look at it in that context, you're baffled. It's like, why is it that when we talk about our history, which defines who we are, I mean, James Baldwin basically says, we carry history with us. We are the history. And if we are the history, why is it then that we neglect that very history that defines who we are and what we're about? It's not just simply to say, if we don't learn from the past, we are doomed to repeat ourselves. It goes beyond that. It goes to the very heart of who we are. I like to say, within the context of like kind of like an ecosystem of how we as human beings are defined. You have religion on the one side, which is the spiritual, and on the other side, the soul. And the soul is our history, because it gives meaning and context to who we are as individuals on an individual level as well as a collective, because we all have personal histories, but we also have a collective history, and we have a universal history. And in South Africa, we seem to have negated that. We have seemed to have pushed it to the periphery. Whereas, yes, we are, you know, other countries are suffering the same, but there is still a sense of importance, a sense of the history matters, and that we must preserve it. And if I may just finish off by saying, one of the problems I believe we make is that we put economics first. Well, I'm not saying it's not important, but it should be the secondary or the byproduct of preserving. The first thing should be that we preserve our history, we ensure that we keep it alive, that we don't allow our institutions, our sites of memory, to fall into disrepair. And once we've done that, we are then able to create a sustainable sector which will attract tourists both locally and internationally, which will enable us then to employ and make a meaningful contribution to the gross domestic product of this country.
And have you made any attempts to get government to try and help here, and what has been the response?
I mean, as Christopher says, you know, they don't get any support. We have this, what I would like to call this extremely archaic and warped approach, which I believe is unconstitutional, because why I say that, first and foremost, the taxes we pay are used by government. And therefore, government to say that we cannot fund independent institutions that fulfill the criteria, like the Apartheid Museum, like Christopher said, ensuring that we educate and ensure that people are kept aware of our past and where we've come from, just like Liliesleaf, just like Hector Peterson, just like Mandela's arrest site, Vilakazi Street, and a whole series of other historical sites. To say that we can't fund you because you are not a state institution is, I believe, unconstitutional, because where does the state get off saying we will fund only institutions that we own, but we will not fund and support independent institutions that play a critical and important role in ensuring that we keep our history alive and in the consciousness of all?
And Christopher, as we round up this discussion, you know, Nicholas said something very poignant here to say, where then do you begin to draw the line as to what government can support and what it cannot support, and talking about the fact that, you know, you may not be state-owned, but certainly there's an important part of South Africa that you carry with you, and that is the history and where we come from. How then does government begin to balance the needs? Because when you look at COVID-19, there's been, you know, really a stalling of services, because government has had to reprioritize some of its priorities. And at the same time, when you look at institutions like yourselves, you're going to be battling going forward. How then does government begin to support you in order to ensure that you're adequately staffed?
You know, the amounts that are being bandied around here to keep us alive is not huge amounts of money at all. And I don't wish to move into the space of where we are trying to discover where and who and what have plundered whatever we have. But to keep your memory alive, to imagine if we all moved into a sort of a space where it's just Alzheimer's and you know nothing, is crazy. And I think the government, for a relatively small amount of money, can keep us alive, for us to be able to reach a point where once again we can attract the visiting public who pay for us. Because that's the point. We have survived to this point. Both Liliesleaf, the Apartheid Museum, and other institutions, we have survived on our own 2 feet. We've survived by the participation of people coming to see us and bringing children to be educated by us. And it's small beans. It's not huge amounts of money. And to not invest in your future and to just wrap it up and cancel it and put it in the back burner and burn it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Because as Nick was pointing out, it's fundamental to our existence to understand where you've come from, to chart where you're going to. And, you know, within a new generation who know very little about our history, it's amazing that within, you know, 25 years, that the horror of apartheid has largely been dissipated within the minds of a new generation of young South Africans. They know nothing about it. And it's critical that we keep that alive. It's small beans, government. Give us a fraction of what is being wasted, stolen, and dissipated in this country to keep us alive.
I tell you what, really, certainly we are going to continue trying to get the Department of Arts and Culture to really take part in this particular conversation, because we did invite them tonight to try and get a sense of really what can they do here to help some of these institutions, particularly when you look at the fact that the importance of history is really priceless. But that's where we leave it for tonight, and that's Nicholas Wolpe there from Liliesleaf and Christopher Till, who's the director of the Apartheid Museum. When we